Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the webinar. I think we'll start with quick introductions of the panel to get you acquainted with the folks that are going to be talking this morning. So my name is Dean Current. I'm co-director for the Center for Integrated Natural Resources and Agricultural Management at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus. Teresa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Teresa Caveney here in New Ulm, Minnesota, the Executive Director of Sustainable Farming Association. And I'm a point person with Dean on all of the case studies that have been done. But our lead on that has been Jared Luhman, and Jared is SFA Soil Health Lead, and Jared's going to be the moderator. Jared, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am, again, Jared Luhman, the Soil Health Lead for SFA. I wrote up the last case studies we did on soil health and then the Silvopasture Case Studies. I also farm in Goodhue, Minnesota with my family. We have a pasture-based pasture-based operation here, but I will talk a little bit later on the Silvopasture Case Studies, and that's kind of my role today.
Great. And maybe Tyler, if you could introduce yourself as well. You do a lot of work on this.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tyler Carlson. I farm here in central Minnesota, and I am the silvopasture and agroforestry lead for SFA.
Great, thanks. Well, let's get started. So I was just looking, I probably need to revise my slide. So we'll be talking about the sustainable agriculture, and I would add and forestry case study database, and the FarmMaps networking tool. And we'll be talking about the FarmMaps networking tool, which includes more than silvopasture, but today we will concentrate on silvopasture. But I want to give you an overview of the tool, where it came from, why we even decided to work on it. And so here we started out doing soil health case studies back in 2016, and Aidan Reed, who will join us if he can, he had some other commitments this morning, but if he can, he'll join us. Can talk a little bit about that, but Jared also has worked on those case studies. And then this latest volume that Jared just finished, which is the Silvopasture Case Studies. These are in PDF and printed format, and they're available on the website. So we'll point you in the direction of those later on in the presentation. So a little bit of the history, how we got started with these case studies and FarmMaps as a networking tool. The Southwest Regional Sustainable Development Partnership Natural Resource Committee met in 2016. And we were talking about, there's a lot of things happening on the landscape, good things, things like cover crops, low-till, no-till farming, and increasing evidence of, the benefits, productive benefits, as well as financial benefits of those systems for a lot of growers. But the concern was, we're seeing this. These are systems that they're good for the environment when practiced, well. And it is a little bit of an art, as Ken Solberg often says. They can improve the bottom line, reduce costs of some of the farming operations. But despite the evidence that was out there that these could be very beneficial, both environmentally and economically, we weren't, seeing the uptake we were hoping to have the impacts we'd like to see on the landscape. So the idea was to really try and put some of these successful operations out there in front of other growers, so they could learn from what their neighbors were doing, and also provide an opportunity, as we often do with field days, to allow farmers to go and see these systems in place and potentially talk to the grower who was implementing them, as a way for us to better promote and get these things adopted. As I think we said in that first meeting, a lot of times we can talk until we're blue in the face, but to really get the adoption, it's better if a grower can talk to another grower to better understand, what are the constraints in getting started? What are the kind of tricks of the trade to make these systems work. So that was really how we started working on these case studies. Initially paper case studies or electronic formats, but then moving into FarmMaps, the database and tool. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this. I spent about a little over 10 years in Central America working on promoting tree planting for farmers in Central America. And I learned a couple of lessons from that. We had a project that was aimed at producing fuel wood, which was considered a need, sometimes more by the scientists than the farmers. So there was a research project that set up research plots all over Central America, and we really knew how to grow trees. Through the research that was done, we could tell you which species might grow well on different plots throughout the region. But one of the things that happened was, we had demonstration farms. We worked with farmers to try some of these systems out. And, as soon as they started implementing these systems, they made changes. And generally, those changes were smart changes. They were adapting those systems to meet their needs. So when we talked about a fuel wood plot, it was just trees, and they were planted 6 feet apart. Farmer looked at that and said, that's not going to, I'm wasting all that land between the trees. So they added crops. And it was really their kind of innovation that made these systems work, and they adapted them to their needs and their situation. And I think one of the things we've learned through these case studies has been fascinating, listening to the farmers talk about the process they've gone through. They are innovative. They're changing their machinery, timing of when they put in their crops and cover crops, if that's the case, different crop mixes, but they're just trying all kinds of things. And that's really a very rich source of information that we need to think about how we make these systems work and so we're trying to capture some of that innovation that goes on, the learning that these producers are engaged in as they implement the systems. And so, part of this is really understanding that, a grower is going to better understand the constraints of a fellow farmer grower, probably better than someone that does not have that experience of dealing with, all of the risks that are involved in farming, weather, changing seasons and whatnot. So that's really what we're trying to get this farmer to farmer connection to be able to talk about how to make these things work. And again, as Ken Solberg says, getting to the art of implementing those new practices. How do you put in a mix that works for you, and how do you tweak that system so it functions and generates the benefits we'd like to see. So we have a database of these cases now. It's collected and put into like an Excel spreadsheet or database. And the way it's set up is, and I'll demonstrate this a little later, is really to provide an option for farmers to identify their farmers close to them or a farmer that has similar farming conditions and be able to contact them and talk about the experience of the other grower as they implemented soil health practices, or in this case today, silvopasture practices, and learn from that experience. So it's a repository of successful cases that can also be used by natural resource professionals for field days, individual visits, and promotion. So we had one of the members of our natural resources working group is a farmer, and he was saying, if I had to run up to Crookston to pick up a part for my tractor, I could take a look at this map and database and identify farmers that are doing engaged in soil health practices or silvopasture in our case, and maybe give them a call and stop and see them as I make the trip up there. So we see a lot of different uses here that, again, identifying farmers that you could have a field day there, and also through the database and the app and the case studies provide information that you could hand out during a field day. And so the way it works is the farmers do provide contact information. We do ask them to share, but that's up to each farmer. They can say, put my email on there, or go ahead and put my phone number. But that is something that each individual grower that is part of our program would decide and indicate how they want to be contacted. And then we have the program, the application FarmMaps, that allows people to locate those case study sites. So the kind of a rough structure of the case studies that we have. So a description of the practice that's being implemented, main source of income on the farm, a little bit of background on the farm, your size, acres. We're considering even if we can get a soils layer, maybe adding that to the map, which would provide additional information. What was the motive for the farmer becoming involved with these different practices, trying them out, the environmental benefits they've experienced as they've implementing these systems, markets, are they selling into specialty markets? What do those markets look like for the products that are coming out of their systems? The personal benefits that they see, including the financial benefits, lowering of costs, maybe in some cases increase in productivity. With the silvopasture systems, farmers often use forested area at the beginning and end of the season when maybe your regular pasture has dried out a little bit and the forage is not as productive. And if you have a shaded area with grasses, they can be more nutritious for your animals. Challenges of adopting these systems and how they work through some of those challenges and address them, recommendations for other farmers, and then of course acknowledgments for all those that were involved and helped out. So this is the kind of the entry page for the app, and we don't have the marker for the silvopasture systems yet. That will be a red marker. But we are adding those, and then eventually we would hope to get an icon that would be more representative of silvopasture, maybe a tree and a cow. But right now we have 3 different types of practices in the database and in the app, and so we're working with MnDOT to indicate where they have snow fences in the state. MnDOT wants to use this to promote their snow fence program to other farmers, allow farmers to talk to each other about the challenges of implementing a snow fence. Snow fences, we've done some work on the economics, and they save, the state, MnDOT, and taxpayers a lot of money where you can establish them. But they are, tricky. You've got to put them about 200 feet from the road. That often gets into a farmer's field, and they have to make some adaptations. But so we have that. Then the soil health case studies I mentioned already, and now the silvopasture. And we really see FarmMaps as a platform to have these case studies that can be used to promote the different practices. So you would go in here and you can see the different markers. You can click on each marker, and that would bring up the different cases on the right-hand side here. So when you enter FarmMaps, it will kind of have a marker where you're at, and then the first cases listed would be the ones that are closest to your location as you enter. Some material in at the outset of the app that explains a little bit about it and the different categories of information that we have for each case study. And then the detail on each farm and practice that is listed as a case. This was one of the soil health cases. And then the ability to map, get driving directions if you were interested in visiting one of these cases after you'd contacted the grower. Or the other thing would be if you were just happen to be out for whatever reason driving, and if you wanted to drive by some of these cases and maybe take a look at what was going on. So that, yeah, and so a little later I'll show a little bit more about that, but that's basically how it works. And so the other thing that's in these each individual case study is a 1 to 2 page PDF, which is the same information that we have in the printed publications and the PDF publications. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared Luhman and ask him to talk a little bit about the Silvopasture case studies and what he's found out. So Jared.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I am just trying to. Yeah, so we did these silvopasture case studies to highlight, obviously, some of the different ways that people are practicing these. And I've just got 2 of the PDFs here pulled up to talk about briefly because I think they're kind of cool demonstrations. There are 5 in the current case studies that are available now on the website. So I would encourage you to check those out at sfa-mn.org. And I'm not sure if they're available on Synram's website or not yet, but they're available there. And but the 2 ways I wanted to highlight, or the 2 types that I wanted to highlight, the first is this regeneration farms. And I wanted to highlight them in particular because they're unique in the way that they approached silvopasture from a very different lens, but still using the same principles of silvopasture of integrating livestock and trees onto a grassland and a grazing system. They did it using chickens and hazelnut trees in a symbiotic relationship, kind of mimicking the native habitat that chickens came out of. They're actually developed out of a jungle bird, which chickens are actually kind of a jungle bird, which was news to me when I learned that. And so they tried to mimic that habitat, but rather than using just standard trees that were maybe available in those jungles at that point, they used trees that were also able to benefit from the impact of the chickens. Hazelnuts are a plant that requires a lot of nitrogen, and chickens eat a lot of nitrogen in their manure and their fertilizer, so it can be a really beneficial system and how they did that. And obviously you may or may not want to build a system just like this, but the way that they looked at using the silvopasture principles of integrating livestock and trees together can be applied in many different ways. And I just wanted to highlight that as an example of one way that people are thinking about silvopasture differently from the standard. And I encourage you to read more about that in the silvopasture case study. And Dean, you can go ahead and go to the next one, which should be on, this is the second page of that as well. And I interviewed Tony Wells, and he, with a group of partners, Reginaldo Haslet Marroquin is the one who designed this system, and they've kind of been building that out and expanding it and trying to build a replicable system that can be replicated over many different sites. And they have a really unique also design of using this to regenerate land and also provide opportunity for farmers to generate a living wage on a very small amount of acreage. One individual silvopasture unit here is 1.5 acres. And an individual can manage 3 to 4 of those units and produce a living wage in just 6 months or 7, the 6-month growing season while they're raising chickens. And so it's a very, very neat system. And they're building out a marketing strategy for those products of hazelnuts and chickens as well. But yeah, definitely encourage you to take a look at that. The next one is Tom Hunter's. And the reason I wanted to highlight his is because he was doing this as a trial. Some of the others have been in it a long time, and they definitely have value to add, and I would encourage you to look at that. But Tom was doing this as a trial on just a small acreage this past summer to really kind of figure out what his costs were, and to get an estimate on what does it cost to transition established woodlands, dense forest and woodlands into a silvopasture type setting. And he found in his costs that they were close to $2,500 an acre, and the majority of those costs were made up by labor and time. And I think that's a really neat thing to consider. And when you hear $2,500 an acre to make silvopasture, that, you know, for me anyway, it can right away kind of, whoa, that's a big number and scare you away from the idea. But if you really think about it, how many of you would pay $2,000 to $2,500 an acre for contiguous land that you were able to graze? I mean, as grazers, we know that contiguous land is the most important thing. The more different chunks of land that you have, the further away you're going to check groups of cattle every day or every few days, the more watering systems you have to deal with and fences that can break down and stuff, the more expensive and the more challenging that gets. And so contiguous land is really important. And this is an opportunity to take what a lot of farmers would view as wasteland, although it's, you know, questionable. Maybe hunters would see value in it, but from a production standpoint, there's not much value you can generate out of these woodland acres. What he found is that for that cost, you can take land that otherwise was worth very little to you and turn it into a productive pasture land acreage. And he's doing that and planning to manage that with fire and with livestock grazing, just as the indigenous cultures kind of managed our landscapes historically. And so I just thought that was really neat to highlight how he's doing that and the costs that go into that, and compare that with the alternative. Another advantage of that is for, you know, the beginning farmer like myself or someone else who maybe doesn't have a heavy, you know, a high amount of equity or cash available to purchase land, that they're able to expand their acreage through sweat equity and labor as opposed to needing that cash. Or maybe somebody who does have cash, they're able to expand even more rapidly because they're able to expand with their cash and equity as well as expand their acreage with sweat equity and labor by clearing woodlands and managing it well. So it was just kind of a neat case study for me to see how this can be used to expand productive acres on pasture land with your labor, especially as we're in a time where land prices are quite expensive and very rarely do they cash flow. So it's just a unique opportunity. But all of the case study participants, all 5 of them, have really unique stories. There are examples of farmers using livestock in different ways and different species of livestock too, sheep, bison, chickens, cattle. And so there are ways to integrate this in any system. And also there are examples in there of farmers who are not only clearing existing woodlands, but using open pasture and transitioning that into a silvopasture system with the use of, you know, planting trees, and then they talk about how they protect those trees from livestock and from predators and from the livestock and whatever that might come and hurt them or graze them down. So lots of good information in that as well. Again, these are available at the SFA website. And the case studies, the individual case studies, will also be on the FarmMaps page. And with that, I would maybe encourage or ask Tyler to hop on. He's one of our case study participants, and talk a little bit about why silvopasture, why you decided that it was important, why you wanted to integrate it on your farm, and some of the benefits that you've seen.
Yes, hello. Sorry for any extra racket here. We've got some construction going on in the barn today. So why silvopasture? I guess silvopasture was kind of my gateway to farming, really. I was studying agroforestry broadly, along with restoration ecology and general sustainable agriculture techniques, and really keyed in on silvopasture as kind of a nexus for a lot of things that I'm interested in, from water quality to climate, you know, perennial sort of pasture-based livestock systems, habitat, and just general diversity and the aesthetics of a silvopasture system as well. And so I had a lot of different reasons that I was interested. And our first approach was to plant trees into open pasture. We planted pine, red pine, Norway pine, and eastern white pine, and also some red oak. Had some trouble with the red oak, getting girdled the first year by voles, and but the pines have done well. We got some issues with pocket gophers and things, but it was mostly just really interested in silvopasture. It seemed like just kind of a win-win-win for the farmer and habitat and all the rest of the things that society needs. And I increasingly see societies, you know, an increasing demand for a diversity of products and services coming from land. And those demands are going up. So we need lands to be multifunctional and multi-purposeful in their provisioning. I think so that was a key reason why I was attracted to silvopasture. And there wasn't really any work going on in Minnesota yet. There was some, but not really much in the way of adoption, not a whole lot in the way of sort of established systems that were generating data. And so I wanted to do some simple sort of, relatively simple. A pine silvopasture is pretty simple compared to some of the ideas that are out there now. This is just, we just took pine plantation, tree spacings and sort of worked with some experts from Missouri and the Southeast where they've been doing this longer, and just adapted what, productive lands are already doing with timber here in Minnesota, with the hopes that it would be more digestible or adoptable for landowners, farmers, whoever, than, maybe something more diverse, which I'm personally more interested in, I guess. Or some of them, the greater the diversity in the tree component, the better. If we can diversify crops, all the better from those trees, get even quicker short-term yields of different fruit and nut crops and things like that. That's great, and there's a lot of interest in that. Later on, about year 2, I started to flash graze with the livestock through the forest on a twice daily move. I wanted to just see how that would work. We had buckthorn that was starting to get a foothold in some of the sort of afforested savanna or oak woodlands that we have here on the farm, and I was just curious to see what I could do with livestock, and whether I saw benefits that outweighed harm from prescribed intensive adaptive grazing approach to woodlands. And I was really encouraged with what I saw as far as the resiliency of the trees and the brush and the forage. It's really actually they're quite resilient when given rest, an appropriate amount of rest. And so I've just been shifting into that. The last 4 years been just trying to clear out a lot of non-oak species. The bur oaks, we have large, approaching 200-year-old bur oak trees on 30 to 100 foot spacing throughout the woods, with a lot of ash and elm and ironwood and buckthorn and box elder and things like that coming up. So I'm just slowly taking out everything else and trying to just sort of give these oaks more light and get more light into the floor of the forest, and just continuing to do that intensive rotation. I'm now grazing twice a year. The areas where we seeded orchard grass and red clover are, at least for portions of the year, I'd say maybe substantially more productive than our open pastures are. The cows are extremely happy in the system when they're there. I tend to use it during high heat. I'm careful to not have the livestock in there during heavy rain events, because the soil is quite, it's not exactly compacted. It's pretty lush forage soil, if you can kind of sense what I'm talking about. So I'm leery about livestock impact, and I think that anyone looking to do forest conversion to silvopasture needs to really have their grazing skills pretty solid under their belt, and be willing to put in the time to move animals frequently through the system, or I think the harms are going to be in excess of the benefits that we can see from it. I guess I'll pause there. I don't know if you have any other questions for me.
No, that was fantastic. I don't know, Dean, do you have any questions? Or if anybody in the attendees have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. And that goes for everything. Anything that Dean talked about, the FarmMaps program or silvopasture, we've got an expert here now. And yeah, any questions, we'd be happy to take them. But otherwise, I don't have any more. And
Okay.
Dean?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Tyler. That was really helpful. And Tyler is also a good resource at SFA if folks are interested. And I saw Jared, you put the links to the case studies in the chat box. So if anybody's interested, those are available. Aiden Reed just joined us. He worked on the MnDOT snow fence and the soil health case studies. So I'm just going to ask Aiden maybe to take about 5 minutes or so to talk about what did you generally find when you were doing those case studies?
Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm late. So remind me, we did kind of an overview of FarmMaps then at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
All right. Sure. Well, I've got just a quick presentation I can show if you all are interested. All right. So basically what I can talk about is just kind of some of our observations from doing these case studies. And these do not include the silviculture ones that Jared was just talking about. Excuse me, silvopasture ones that Jared was just talking about. So again, I apologize I wasn't here. So that FarmMaps that we were demonstrating includes not just our 25 soil health cases that are up there, but also now we're in the process of adding 30 snow fence cases. And kind of, I'm sure as Dean explained, the intention behind that is to make this more of a versatile tool, kind of expanding the audience and increasing the function of that. So just a little bit about where we got this information from. On that map, which I'll bring up again in a little bit, you can see we had those 25 soil health cases. It was a pretty broad stretch, all the way from basically the North Dakota, Canada border, all the way down to Western Minnesota and quite a few in the South region. And then for our snow fence cases, we tried to get an equally broad blend there. So MnDOT is separated into 8 service districts. We tried to get a broad swath of kind of representative of all of those different service districts. So our information is coming from a very large portion of the state, and that's kind of our intention. And so what's been included in these? So in terms of snow fences, again, we're trying to capture as many different observations as we can. So in our set, we had 17 living snow fences. And that's really, when we're talking about like a conservation, something that could be integrated into a farming system to kind of yield a multitude of benefits, we're really talking about those living snow fences. Standing corn is another option. If you're just looking at having kind of a societal return as well as a new revenue stream, that's another option. It doesn't have, what our thoughts are is that it doesn't have as many kind of cascading impacts on the operation as a living snow fence would, but still has an impact. And then also structure snow fences. Again, just a different set of benefits that are available to folks. These were all, I think, from what I can recall, rental agreements. So they are providing, an additional revenue stream, which is really nice for folks, especially on kind of marginal land. But they do not have kind of those, again, those cascading effects that impact other elements of the operation. And then for the soil health case studies, we had an even broader stretch. So we looked at things such as cover crops, managed rotational grazing, conservation tillage, no-till, just a whole broad set of practices. Some of these that weren't on there that are a little more general, just things like, vegetated buffers. Folks who are actually using, some sort of practice that is actually giving them a return on a vegetated buffer, whether that's grazing or haying or something. It's just a really broad set of practices. And so one of the things we're trying to capture in these cases is, where did this come from? How did this start? And so we discuss motivations. And this is something that's, helpful just for an individual producer who is trying to, begin their own soil health journey or looking to add, a living snow fence to their operation, but also kind of, as for land and ag professionals, what's getting people to do these things. And the snow fences and the soil health are pretty similar. So the motivations for those adding snow fences, really number one, most commonly we're seeing what's basically, an affirmation of civic duty or a dedication to public safety. In comments you see like that would be someone saying, I would do this without the money. The payment is nice, but I do this without the money. Obviously, that's reflective of that person, particular person's financial situation, but that's not an uncommon sentiment. Is that the benefit? One life saved is worth however many hours that I dedicate to this a year. Another, I would say the secondary, the other largest motivation for the snow fence participants is financial. Particularly in folks doing standing corn rows, we're seeing they'll weigh the cost to the commodity prices. So if corn goes up, they're less likely to leave that corn standing. But it is kind of a way to hedge your bet. That an annual rental agreement with MnDOT is giving you a set guaranteed income regardless of commodity prices, and usually it's a pretty decent return. That's also a motivation to a lesser extent for folks doing living snow fences. A lot of cases that's an easement, so you're more of a one-off payment rather than that recurring rental. Although we do have a couple that are rental agreements. And then with the structure snow fence, it is usually a rental agreement. Transportation kind of ties in with public safety, but also it's more just those folks who are saying it's easier for me to get to work. It's easier for me to check my pastures. It's easier for me to get to the gas station. The mailman really likes it, that kind of thing. And additionally, for the conservation and aesthetic side of things, that's really something we're pretty uniquely seeing in the living snow fence, which is to be expected. These are folks who are happy to see grouse return to their farm, especially in the more northern areas. Or even pheasants in some of the more western and southern areas. And then aesthetic. People just like having trees. And I'm sure that's something that was kind of remarked on in the silvopasture side. It just, a lot of folks just like the idea of having trees integrated into their farming operations or into their enterprises. For soil health motivations, we had kind of a broader set: financial, environmental, and one that's harder to define, which we just call stewardship. So a lot of people embarked on kind of their changes to their practices for soil health, in terms of soil health, for a financial return. Not in like not in kind of a negative connotation kind of way, but more in a way that it just became unreasonable to be making these types of investments and to be chasing these kinds of yields when it wasn't actually helping the financial bottom line. And so a lot of folks who have been able to reduce equipment costs, labor costs, fuel costs, nutrient costs, all of that has really helped out in basically lowering a break-even point. So even if yields have gone down or stayed the same, that bottom line has dropped a lot in a lot of these cases. And that's been a huge motivating factor for a lot of folks. And other than that, there's a large environmental component. There's an intrinsic desire to improve, soil and water health. What's good for the planet is good for the farm in a lot of cases. And that is kind of tied in with that stewardship idea too. We also took a little bit of a look at where these ideas came from, where these initial motivations came from, whether that was staff or something that whether these adopters independently developed. And then obviously a lot of these case studies came from those published with SFA and U of Extension. And any other questions, I'm happy to answer, whether about what we found or how we found it.
Okay, we'll move ahead then. So here, I know Jared had put some information in the chat box about connections to resources. And a lot of what's listed here is on the SFA website. So that link that Jared put there can probably get you to most of this. So they've got their website, they have fact sheets on silvopasture in Minnesota, the how-tos, how to do it, converting wooded area into silvopasture site, and a resource assessment as you do that. And then there's some podcasts that are available as well, and there are links there as well that you can look at. There's an interview with Tyler, who you've already heard from. And then also there is this Silvopasture Learning Network, which has been part of the project that we're working on right now that is funded by the LCCMR, and a Silvopasture resource manual. The case studies, again, Jared put the link up, but it is also on the SFA website. So we do have 3 volumes of the soil health case studies, and now the latest, the Silvopasture volume. And then we do have the Silvopasture Learning Network that you can sign up for, and this is a source of information on the project and a lot of these things we're talking about, the resources, if you're interested in Silvopasture. Teresa, I'm wondering if you might want to just talk a little bit about the LCCMR project, the partners involved, and where we're at with that.
Yes, thank you, Dean. Also, just to note, I put the link to the Silvopasture Learning Network in the chat, and really invite anybody who has not already signed up for that learning network to join it. The LCCMR project began, gosh, over 2 years ago, as we really tried to develop a proposal, and we means University of Minnesota Extension. Dean was one of the principals. Dr. Jomi Zamora was involved, Great River Greening and Sustainable Farming Association. The program was intended to look at the thousands of acres of oak savanna and other woodlands in Minnesota that are either underutilized or blighted and in need of restoration, and utilizing silvopasture methods as a way to get a better both economic return from the resource and also to restore the resource. And the program, as we developed it, included a robust outreach and education program that includes a mix of workshops, webinars, which we kind of converted to last year with COVID, field days, and a research component that Tyler has been very involved in, and Gary Wyatt also, who is on this webinar, has been involved in. And the research component is really introducing managed grazing and looking at the ecosystem services that result at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge. My colleagues, Kent Solberg and Doug Voss, have been involved in that, along with Tyler. There are a number of offerings, including an upcoming workshop in May at Minneopa State Park that include both a workshop followed by a tour of Minneopa and the oak savannas there. And Minneopa is down here in Gary and my neck of the woods in southern, kind of west central Minnesota. There are oak savannas all over, but we are looking at silvopasture as, I want to say, a practice that's applicable in really any type of woodland. We're looking at going back for continued LCCMR funding in future years. Have about a year and a half left on the, I guess, a year and a half left on the project. And I don't know, Dean or Gary, if you wanted to add to that. The Learning Network is really a feature of the LCCMR project, really designed to build a robust cohort of agricultural professionals, farmers, SWCD, forestry, extension people who are interested in learning about silvopasture and in training others and turning others on to really how to practice silvopasture. So please, Tyler and Dean and Gary, add to that.
Probably the important thing is there are a lot of resources, a lot of folks interested in this right now, a lot of work going into getting good information out to growers, to landowners that are interested. And the Learning Network is an example of that. So please, if you have any questions, SFA again has a lot of good information on their website.
And these actually aren't yet on our calendar, but will be on the calendar very, very soon. One is actually June 12th. We have a volunteer day at Tyler's farm, and Great River Greening will be providing some of the volunteers. Then April 23rd, which is a Friday, Kent is doing a two-part, a morning session and an afternoon session at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, excuse me. And that really is to teach people more about use of temporary fencing in a silvopasture setting. And then I believe it's May 24th is the workshop that we are planning here down in Minnesotan. So we actually have stuff kind of coming up in the next month.
Great, thanks.
There's also an adaptive grazing webinar on April 20th with Kent Solberg and Dr. Sue Wicca and Tom Preeb on adaptive grazing and silvopasture.
That's right.
Great. Yeah, I think this is actually my last slide. But I think, you know, as we look at this, again, FarmMaps we see as a platform for a lot of these different systems. And we'd love to add other agroforestry systems as we move ahead. But that's kind of the value of it. The more variety we have, the more cases, the more useful it is to folks that are looking for information, because, you know, conditions vary quite a bit from one farmer to another and their objectives. So we are going to publish the app now, and we'd love to have any comments on that. We want to look for ways to improve that, and we still have time to do that with the LCCMR project. We've got one of our members that's talking about, you know, he'd like to expand this to the U.S. And he actually has international partners that he says might be interested. Don Rajkowski, who is a soil scientist. And then I think I mentioned we might try and see if we can get a soils layer added to this that would give someone a little more information that's looking for conditions similar to their own. And then there already are mentors out there through the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, and we're trying to link with them as well to see how we can, you know, share information between, you know, other organizations and the work that we're doing. With that, again, thanks, and we do appreciate any comments, and feel free to send us questions afterwards as well.
Awesome.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us.